so I can record this for posterity's sake. But again, if you have any questions as I go along, feel free to ask. I notice a lot of y'all are on mute, but if you just want to unclick the mute button, I don't have to see your face. If you want to just unclick the mute button and ask me a question, I'll be sure to answer as we go along. So with that said, can everybody see my screen okay? Everybody good? Okay, I see a couple of nods coming up. Great. So here's one of the cool things I like about doing night photography, not just astrophotography. I should have called this more night photography because this is really the overarching technique. Is I love shooting pictures of kind of things I've seen during the day, but when you go back at night, they kind of take on a whole different feel. This is a rock cairn actually in West Texas near Childress, where I used to live. Unknown origin, might have been made by cowboys, might have been made by Comanche Indians when they were roaming the place, might have been made by someone 2 years before I even got there, and they told me it was old. But either way, it was a cool little rock pile, probably about 4 feet tall, up on top of this big ridge that looked back to the north, and you can see the glow of the town of Childress as I'm looking back to the north, and was able to capture it under the stars and really just kind of giving an engaging view that you just don't get during the day. And that's just some of the techniques we're going to talk about. And again, I hope that you'll see that it's pretty easy. So the basic equipment, you just don't need a lot of stuff. That's the beautiful thing about it. I remember when I first started trying this back in the film days. I mean, I didn't have much equipment then, but even as I got more and more equipment, you just don't need a lot of good stuff. A DSLR, a mirrorless camera, if you still use a DSLR, I actually think, at least right now, that may be a better tool to use, especially if you're doing the longer exposures. When I go out and shoot pictures, I'll take my mirrorless, but I'll also take a couple of DSLRs just to have some different cameras to use. I think they handle the noise better, especially on the longer exposures. Some kind of wide angle lens, and that's not always the case. We'll talk a little bit about moon photography in a minute. We'll briefly touch on that, but that's takes a little bit more than a wide angle lens. But since the star of the show, typically when you're doing nighttime photography is the sky, then definitely a wide angle lens is what you're going to want to use. A tripod, I've said this a million times. It's a must when you're doing night photography, like we're talking about. But it may be one of the most indispensable pieces of photography equipment that you can have, and it'll automatically make you a better photographer over time. So it's just a good tool to have, but a good sturdy tripod. A cable release or an intervalometer. If you don't know what that is, a cable release is just one of those cords that you can hook to your camera that instead of having to push the button, you can actually press the shutter with the button on the cable release. But more importantly, you can hold the shutter down and do longer exposures with it. I shouldn't even say most cameras. The cameras with which I am most familiar, let me put it that way, the longest exposure it can do without a cable release, like my cameras, my Canons, are 30 seconds. And so if I want to do anything beyond 30 seconds, I've got to have a way besides using my finger to be able to lock that shutter down and walk away from it. An intervalometer works good for that too. I know Canon makes one and Nikon makes one, and I know there's a bunch of third-party ones as well that you can. The intervalometer will set the interval between shots. That's important if you're doing star trails, because star trails, and I'll show you this in a minute, is a series of just a bunch of star pictures, and then you blend them all together in post-processing. That's the demonstration I'm going to show you, and show you really how easy it is. So you need a cable release or an intervalometer. A lot of the newer cameras have the intervalometer built into them, but you still need that simple cable release to be able to hold the shutter open if you're doing exposures much over 30 seconds. I always recommend a headlamp. I've got pretty good night vision. I can walk around in the dark and see pretty good, and things really don't scare me. But if you're scared of snakes or other critters that move around at night, headlamp is definitely something you want to try to include in your repertoire. And then extra rig. And what I mean by that is when you're talking about night photography, it's not, when I go shoot pictures of wildlife, Sharon can tell you, she's been on the in the Everglades with me before, is if there's a bird in front of me, I may take 200 pictures of the same bird, and it's just for insurance sake to make sure I get one right. With night photography and astrophotography of any sort, it's sort of a quality over quantity venture, because a lot of times you're shooting at least minimum 20, 30-second exposures at the maximum. I'll show you some examples where I've done some longer exposures later on. It's just a slow process, and you're setting the camera on a tripod. everything's got to be real deliberate, so everything comes out right. And I'm not a night owl anymore. I used to be when I was younger, but now I kind of like being in bed about 9 o'clock every night because I get up really early in the morning. And because of that, I don't really have an urge to want to stay out all night most of the time. So I'm really trying to get my pictures between the first 2 or 3 or 4 hours of nighttime. And so because of that, because you are shooting such slow exposures and such slow shutter speeds. I mean, such slow shutter speeds, and you're so deliberate in your approach to this and making sure everything's right. It's not unusual to come away with just 4 or 5 pictures a night. So one thing I do a lot of is I'll duplicate all this. I never sell cameras anymore because you just don't get any money for them when you try to sell them. And so I might have 2 or 3 older DSLRs that still work good. They may not be the most modern cameras, but they were good when they came out, so they can still work good today. And then extra tripods and extra wide angle lenses, and just set up 2 or 3 shots at the same time and fire them all at once. That way, I'm at least tripling my efforts when I'm out at night. So the extra rig stuff is really a good way to go if you've got some extra equipment. Tripods are cheap. You don't have to have $1,000 really right stuff tripod to do this with. Travel tripods, because typically if you're shooting a wide angle lens and using a DSLR camera, they're pretty light, so you can use a lighter weight tripod. But the extra rigs I think are important, and so that's really all you need. And like I said, you don't need a whole lot of stuff to be able to accomplish this. Just some minimal gear. And then a big part of it, I think, is choosing a subject. You know, for the most part, you're always composing with a lot of sky in the picture. And so when I think about that, of course, you got to find a place with a good open area of the sky, and in a fairly dark area. It doesn't have to be super dark to do some of these techniques, but a fairly dark area to be able to capture the pictures of the elements in the night sky. And one of the things I almost always do is try to find a foreground subject. And so in this case, this is a picture of the moon at 800 millimeters, which the moon's out of focus on purpose on this, but the foreground subject were the migrating blackbirds. And I shot this just right outside my front door. And again, the whole genre is a slow process, so you'll only take a few pictures when you go through this. So that's why pre-planning becomes really, really important. And whenever I'm out, Sharon, I'm going to pick on her a little bit. She's coming up for a workshop. I've got a day workshop I've got coming up in a couple of weeks, and I'll actually it's in a week and a half. I'll actually go out during the day and pre scout some subjects, so that way I can go straight out to them. And because you're in the dark, and for some reason, for me anyway, when when I'm outside at night, I've got good night vision, but the thing that is affected the most is my depth perception, because when I go out at night, I may think I'm a lot further from a subject than what I really am. And then when I finally see it in the picture, it's smaller than what I think it's going to be. It works the opposite. I've done this a million times. I'll go out in the morning and set up a pop-up blind for wildlife, and I think I'm a proper distance away from a food source or a water source. And then when the sun comes up and I can see it better, I end up being a lot closer or a lot further away than I thought it was. So the pre-planning stuff goes a long way for me, and just being able to figure out where I need to be. And also, and I'll explain this a little more later, I also look for foreground subjects that face the south or the east. Well, one of the reasons they face south is because if you like that look of the North Star and you're doing star trails, and the and you like the pinpoint of the one North Star and all the other stars circling around it, is you look for stuff that faces south, so that way you're looking north at the foreground subject. And then the east, I'll explain that a little more, but that has more to do with using the moon as a light source, number one, and number two, it has a lot to do with the moon comes up. If the moon comes up fairly early, I'm not having to stay up till 4 in the morning to shoot pictures and wait for the moon to move around. So again, I'll go out early and look for these locations and try to figure out what makes a good shot, and just be prepared to when it gets dark, I go out there and I'm just ready to set up and not have to think through it again. I'm trying to take advantage of all the time I have and not fumble around in the dark, because everything gets a little bit harder when you're trying to do this in the dark. And then I use apps like Sunseeker and Photo Pills to predict the movement of the moon. And I also use another app called Skywatch that helps me find the constellations. If you don't know how to find the North Star, it's really easy. All you got to do is find the Big Dipper, and the last two stars of the Big Dipper, the pan of the Big Dipper, will make an imaginary straight line up to the North Star. But it's the North Star is the only star in the northern hemisphere that uh, that doesn't appear to move in the sky. I mean, because it's right over the pole, it wobbles a little bit, but because it's primarily over the North Pole, whenever the Earth turns, it doesn't appear to move. So you'll get that star pinpoint, and the other stars will appear to move around it. But I again use Sunseeker and PhotoPills just to predict when the moon's coming up or when this moon's not going to be up, and then be able to predict, especially like the Milky Way and when the Milky Way will be overhead, and use some of those apps that are available to us today. And they're pretty ingenious for help figuring that out, because back in the day, you used to either do it on memory or I used to take notes, or even I would just go out and see if I had something to take a picture of. And then the last thing is, and this is kind of a Texas thing because so much of it is private property. But even if you're wherever you live, if you're planning on shooting at night, just make sure you respect private property, because the last thing I want to do is try to explain to someone in the dark when they don't really know my intentions while I'm on their land. So I always seek permission. If it's not public land, I always seek permission. If it is public land, I always make sure I've got the proper permits to be where I need to be. And most of the time, the permits are just an entry pass that you've got to pay to get into a state park or somewhere else like that. So again, here's a few of the night shots I've taken. That's the picture on the upper left, and this is, we'll get into a little bit of this in a minute. This is an old two-room schoolhouse. It's up in the Texas Panhandle. You can see it was shot with some shorter star trails. I kind of like that look, and a lot of this is sort of whatever you like. And me, I like the short star trails, but there's a picture of an old two-room schoolhouse. I actually lit it from inside and gave it some light inside, so it would add a little bit of dimension to it, and also did a little bit of light painting from the outside, and that's what gives it that reddish cast. But if you'll notice, there's some shadows on the eaves, and those shadows are for a reason. And then below that, so you kind of got a double whammy of a windmill that's well illuminated. That is not light painted. I'll show you the technique on that in a minute. But I got the benefit of the windmill turning in the wind and get the blurred motion of the blades there. And on the right, it's a picture of the Milky Way. That's actually from Botswana in southern Africa, is where I shot that from. But right now is a good time of year to shoot pictures of Milky Way. I was out with another group north of here, about a mile north of my property. I've got an ongoing class called the Nature Photography Academy, and we had our night sky session this about a week, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, or almost 2 weeks ago. And by about 9 o'clock in the evening, once it starts getting good and dark, you can see the Milky Way clearly overhead that runs from kind of northeast to southwest. And it was kind of coming up over the horizon, but you can see it this time of year. And there's a certain time of year that the Milky Way is more visible than others, visible early. And it just happens to be in Texas. Summertime is that time. And so here's where the rubber meets the road on some specific techniques. And these, again, you can take notes on these. You can watch the replay of the webinar when I get it posted. But this is always a pretty basic setup. Every time I go out, I start with these basic setups. And the good thing about shooting pictures at night like this is when you're shooting pictures during the day and the shutter speeds are so fast, you have just a not much margin in error to get it right or wrong. But the good news is with night photography, because you are shooting slower shutter speeds and it takes longer to achieve proper exposure, you've got a whole lot more latitude to adjust the ISO or adjust your aperture and see how it's going to work. But these are the basic settings I start with. I started at a 3200 ISO, and this is for the stars now, mind you. ISO 3200, f2.8, or some lenses won't go that wide, but they start at f4. Like I've got a 24 to 105 zoom I use a lot, and it's f4, but there's not much difference in the two. You'll see a little bit of difference in how dark or light the image is based on shooting at f2.8 or f4, but the differences are minimal. And so those are the two basic settings I start with. And then this is where it gets a little trickier. So I'm going to bring up I'll kind of walk you through this. This is how you determine if you're wanting just pinpoint stars. Let me share. Can y'all see my calculator? If you're wanting just pinpoint stars and you're not wanting star streaks, so just the pinpoint stars is what I'm talking about here. Here's the basic formula for calculating shutter speed. So you take the focal length. Let's say I'm shooting at 16 millimeters, and you got to know the crop factor of your camera. If it's a full frame sensor, then it's 1. So it'd be 16 times 1, and that'd be 16. So you do 500 millimeters divided by 16, and that's the lens you're using. And that tells you you can shoot a maximum of 31 seconds without seeing any streaking in the stars. Now, if you're shooting that same 16 millimeters and you've got, like I've got a Canon 90D, which is a crop factor, whoops, and so I say 16 millimeters times, and that's a 1.6 crop on that. So it's 25.6. Oops, hang on, let me make sure I did that right. 16 times 1.6. That's, yeah, 25.6. So if I do 500 divided by 25.6, that tells me at that focal length, the longest shutter speed I can use without seeing streaking, again, I'm trying to get pinpoint stars, is 19.5 seconds. Does that make sense? It's a pretty simple formula, but that's the one. And because, you know, I'm always thinking about a lot of things, and because I got a lot of things on my mind at any given time, these basic settings I keep in the notes app on my phone. So when I go out, I don't, you know, I'm not going to sit there and say I'm so brilliant, but when I go out and I'm taking pictures of stuff, I can refer to the calculator on my phone. You can do that in Photo Pills and some of the other apps, but I just try to simplify it and have these basic settings on my phone and be able to figure it out. But, and the reason why is to get pinpoint stars, the more you zoom in them, the more accentuated the movement of the stars are. So the wider the lens you have, the longer the shutter speed it can be. And then again, with the crop factor, it makes the effective focal length of the 16 millimeters 25 millimeters. And so because the lens is increasing magnification to some degree, it's going to increase how long it's going to take to be able to notice those stars, or it's going to decrease the amount of time how long it'll take to notice those stars moving. But again, this shutter speed formula is based on those basic settings of ISO 3200, f2.8 or f4, and so it's a pretty simple thing. Usually, if you don't want to remember all that, I'd say 20 to 30 seconds. Try out a couple of shots. It's not that too long to wait. Look at it on the back of your camera, zoom in, see how that looks, and then you can adjust from there. But usually 20 to 30 seconds is kind of the sweet spot when you're using the most wide angles. And then manual focus, that's a key part there. If you shoot autofocus, the camera will continually try to hunt, and it'll be maddening. So make sure when you start out, go ahead and switch your lens to manual focus. And then what I coach people on is it's hard to look through the viewfinder and achieve accurate focus. So I use an LCD screen, and then all these LCD screens, you can either pinch it and magnify it, or it's got a button. My cameras have a button on the back with a magnifier glass that you can zoom in on the spot. So what I always try to do is find the brightest star I can on the LCD screen, zoom in, and then manually focus. You can use focus peaking if you've got that built into your camera. But usually the thing is just try to get it as pinpoint as you can, and that way it's in focus. And then once you get it in focus, a lot of times, and this happened to me the last shoot I was out, because I was trying to teach other people, I wasn't being mindful of my manual focus ring on my lens. It got bumped a little bit, and I had a few pictures where the stars were out of focus. But so I advise people, if you've got gaffer tape, bring a piece of gaffer tape and you can put across the lens, just one little strip to hold the focus in place once you get it there. And that way, when you're ready to move to another spot, it's just a matter of picking up your camera and moving it somewhere else. Because the thing is, especially when you're shooting on dark nights like right now, we have the shutter speed. Once it gets dark, the shutter speed in this basic setup, it's not like shooting during the day, whereas the sun comes up and it's getting brighter and brighter, your shutter speed or your ISO changes. It's not like you're having to deal with a lot of shadows because everything's in shadow. And so you're shooting these long exposures. And because once you get everything set in place, nothing really changes after that. You just pick up the camera and move somewhere else. So a piece of gaffer tape will help ensure that it stays in focus after you move from spot to spot. But it's always a good practice just to check it every single time as well. And then star trails are made by the way I make them. And again, one of the things I always explain is there's a million different ways of doing these same techniques. What I explain to you is my way of doing things. I usually take a pretty simplistic approach to doing them. And so my way is not the only way. It's not the best way. It's just my way. And the star trails that I'm going to show you how to make in a minute are used by stacking a series of photos or taking a series of star photos using these same basic techniques and then stacking them together in post-processing. I'm going to show you how to do that. And if you've never seen that done before, I think you'll be shocked at how easy it is. And then just a few more examples of pictures. Again, that's the picture on the upper left of the blue tree and the stars. That's a couple of techniques I'm using. We'll talk about that in a minute. The picture on the lower right, that's just a basic long exposure star trail. And then the picture on the, lower left, and the picture on the right, that's that combined a little bit of light painting and then the Milky Way going overhead this tree. And then the next technique I'm going to talk about, this is actually, well, I'll wait on that one before I tell you the punchline on this part. But again, more pictures at night. I think by preference, I think the long star trails look cool. I like shorter star trails. That's kind of the technique I like the best, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And so we talked about stars. That's a pretty simple setup. We also talk about the moon. Again, Sharon's coming for the workshop where we're going to use the moon as a light source. And so the moon really has two purposes in that night sky for photographers. You can use it as a subject or you can use it as a light source. And I love using it as a light source. And that's what we'll dive into coming up pretty quick. But if you think the moon is a subject, I found this to be true. The exposures can be pretty tricky. And so that moon picture I showed you a while ago, I shot it with a 600 millimeter lens to give it some detail. But you can notice this is the actual information, metadata information that came out of the camera. And if you notice here, that was shot at 1/1600th of a second. That's a pretty fast shutter speed. And the reason why I shot it so fast was because the moon is so big in the sky. If you shoot shutter speeds very slow, you'll notice the movement as it moves across the sky because it's moving at a pretty good clip. If you've ever watched the moon or sun come up or go down, you know how fast it moves in relation to us. And so when it gets into the sky, it doesn't seem to move as fast in relation because we have nothing to compare it to. There's no foreground object like the horizon to compare it to, but it's still moving at the same clip. And so you've got to shoot at a relatively fast shutter speed. And if you notice there, one of the things too, and I coach this all the time when you're taking pictures during the day, if the subject has a dark background, the cameras will tend to overexpose it. So you have to do exposure compensation. You have to take light away or do it on the minus side. And if you notice, this one was shot at -3 stops under what the camera recommended. And again, it's because the dark background around it is biasing the way the camera sees that scene. So it's not an easy shot, but just remember, if you want to go out and take moon shots, use a big telephoto lens, 400, 800, whatever. And then when your camera decides what the shutter speed and exposure ought to be, underexpose it by 2 or 3 stops and just bracket it in that regard and make sure your shutter speed gets higher. So I would recommend at least 500 or 1,000th of a second shutter speed to be able to stop the motion of the moon. And to do that, you just got to adjust the ISO until you can get it there. But again, the key part is every moonshot I've ever taken that shows detail in the moon, you've got to underexpose the picture. This is a good example here. This is an early moon with it first coming up, but because I underexposed the shot, it made the trees go dark, which that was fine with me. And so just keep that in mind as you're taking pictures of the moon. And here's the fun part. The moon is a light source. This is what really got me inspired to do nighttime photography, because that photographer I'd mentioned a long time ago, he used the moon as a light source. And that's what I like doing, is going out on 3/4 to full moon nights. And it's either the waxing or waning 3/4 to a full moon is where this really applies to, uh, because you can shoot at longer shutter speeds and lower ISOs, and you can get a more creative look. And so this is my base exposure when I'm using the moon as a light source. Again, a 3/4 to a full moon is what I use. And I usually shoot at ISO 100, and I do 5-minute exposures at f5.6. And that's where I found to be my sweet spot and getting the depth of field I want, and to be able to get the creative technique I want. So this shot here, and really this works great if you have a little few clouds in the sky, because you get those streaky clouds like you see here. But this is an old farmhouse a little bit west of Quanah, Texas. But you can see all this illumination on the front side of this building is not made with any kind of light source other than the moon. So if you think about photography 101, and we're taught to use reflectors to reflect light from the sun and bounce it onto your subject, whether you're talking about flowers or someone's face, if you've ever used those reflectors. Well, the moon is a giant reflector in the sky. And so because it's such a it's not a really bright light source, it just takes longer to do the exposure. And that's where I think from a creative standpoint, the 5-minute exposure really comes in handy, because one, you get this really soft kind of golden hour sort of light that reflects onto the subject. Number two, you get a little bit of star streaking at night, which kind of gives it an otherworldly effect. And then number three, on this shot, you get the clouds moving, which I think adds a pretty dynamic effect to it. And then plus, since you're shooting longer exposures, it gives you a chance, like in this picture, and this is crazy. And if you've never seen it before, I have to show you. But if you wear dark clothes when you're doing shots like this, you can walk in, as long as you stay moving, you can walk in front of your camera all you want, and to be able to go do light painting. So I actually started this picture, walked into the scene, walked around the back side of this old farmhouse, and then shined a spotlight inside with an amber gel over the spotlight to kind of give it this golden glow that you can see coming out of the windows, and then walk back around. As long as you don't have any kind of light source and you're walking in the dark, and then once I hide myself, you just don't show up in the picture. And the reason why is if you wear dark clothing, you're not standing still long enough to reflect enough light for the camera to pick you up. And so it's a pretty neat trick that is I don't really see it talked about a whole lot, but you definitely can do that. And again, the difference is if you're shooting pinpoint star pictures, I'm not fast enough to be able to move out in front of my camera and be able to move back before the end of the picture. So by using the moon as a light source, it just gives you a lot more time to kind of be creative and be able to shoot pictures like this. Oops. Again, this shot here is in front of an old store in the ghost town of Medicine Mound, Texas, and it was using the moon as a light source, and then the stars in the background starting to streak around. And this is kind of the best of both worlds. I use the moon as a light source here, but I use it to backlight. This is the very large array in New Mexico, but I used it to backlight. So I use more of the traditional, figuring out because I used a little bit of a telephoto lens on this one. So I had to figure out what my shutter speed needed to be based on that lens using the formula I gave you. And then I just positioned myself where the moon would just be barely peeking out behind the satellite, just so that way it would give the satellite some definition against the sky. Now, if I hadn't had the moon in this picture, the satellite would have been just lost against the dark sky, or it wouldn't have been as defined. And so that's where I use the moon in a different kind of way as a backlight as opposed to a front light. But believe it or not, in these pictures, I need to remind you, they're with minimal post-processing, all these pictures I've showed you so far. And so what's amazing about using the moon as a light source is this was taken at probably 10 o'clock at night. Moon's overhead. Again, this is a little bit later in the evening, because we're looking kind of back to the southeast a little bit in this shot, and I know that because if you know anything about Christian cemeteries, everyone's always buried east to west. And so these headstones are facing to the west. So I'm looking kind of to the southeast. But again, you get the whole convergence of the clouds moving, the stars streaking, and then just kind of the otherworldly sort of look of the light that's being bounced off the moon. And it's just a different look than you get with pictures during the daytime. and it's a different look than you get with traditional just pinpoint star pictures. So that's why of all the kind of astrophotography or nighttime photography, if you will, pictures I like going out and shooting pictures with the moon as the subject first. And this is Caprock Canyon State Park, moonlit. You can see definitely this is looking more towards the north because that the bright stars you see in the upper right, that's actually the Big Dipper. And then again, these two stars on the end of the Big Dipper, if you follow those up, the next brightest star you see up in here to the right, upper right, will be the North Star. But you can see how much light comes in because we're creating these defined shadows just using nothing but moonlight. So that's why it's I think it's such a neat way of going. And so one of the last things, since I've kind of touched on a couple of times, is light painting. What light painting is, if you don't know, it's a way of using a light source to add color and detail to an image. And I like using it. I use it about half the time. Sometimes I think it's appropriate. Sometimes I think it may be a little much, but I think it's kind of cool when you're able to do it. But I'll tell you what, it's an acquired skill because the amount of light you have to put on a subject for a 30-second exposure at ISO 3200 is a lot less forgiving than the amount of light you can put on your subject at a 5-minute exposure. And so you can, with those longer exposures, using the moon as a as your light source and shooting at the low ISOs, like I mentioned, uh, you can spend a little more time light painting. If you're trying to shoot a pinpoint picture of the stars and you're doing a 20-second exposure, I mean, the amount of light, the intensity of your light, and it's hard to describe how much to do because it depends on the factors of the type of light you're using and the intensity of that light you're using and how close you are standing to the subject. And so that's why I say it's an acquired skill. It's something you just got to go out and experiment with and find out what works best for you. But it's definitely worth doing. And so this picture here is again, if you look over here on the left, you can clearly see the Big Dipper, and these two stars that are on the bottom of the Big Dipper, they point to this next brightest star, and that star right in the middle of the circle is the North Star. But I used a red gelled spotlight to paint for about 10 or 15 seconds on this canyon face just to kind of give it a red glow, just to, again, just trying to be creative and make it look a little bit otherworldly. And this was an available light source I used down the road from this. This is again at the old ghost town of Medicine Mound in Hardeman County, Texas. This was down the road was a guard light, and it kind of gave that amber cast. And so experimenting, we were able to do the technique of a pinpoint star, but there was enough light. It wasn't bright light, but it was far enough down the road where there's enough light that emanated from that guard light that's or the street light that's down the road to be able to paint this and really kind of give it a pleasing sort of and balanced look. It's kind of we got the dark blue of the sky and sort of the amber color of the light coming into it. And I thought it looked kind of nice. Now, if I was being a purist, I should have went back and spotted out this old electrical line coming in. I guess I could at some point, but it doesn't bother me that bad. But again, this is sort of the combination of doing all of it. We're doing the typical astrophotography of the stars. We're using available light, letting light paint. And again, I'd like to tell you that I followed the rule, and the rule that on the formula I told you is how I determine the shutter speed on this. And it just so happened where it was just the amount of light where it turned out perfectly. But sometimes that won't be the case. So that's where you got to get out and experiment. It's hard with light painting, it's hard to say what will work and what wouldn't. This is actually a picture I shot for a magazine story. I wanted a deer crossing sign, and if I'm critiquing myself on this, I should have had the deer crossing sign better lit on the top so you could clearly see it was a deer. But this is where I use the moon as a backlight, and then it's a little bit dark. You can see the skies, but I'm actually the one driving through the picture. And so I set the camera up on the side of the road. This is out in a rural area when I used to live out in the Texas Panhandle. Set the camera up on the side of the road, and then had my truck parked just out of frame. And then I just went down the road with my running lights on just to leave the leave the taillight street going through. And when I got to the other end, I turned my lights off. And then because I did have a full moon out, I could see the road pretty good. And because there's no traffic on the road, I'm making sure I stay safe. I turned around and drove back in the dark, and then took 2 or 3 shots at this shot and finally got it. But again, that ended up being a double page spread in the magazine, this particular picture. But again, using the moonlight, using the dark of the sky, using a little bit of light painting with the sign, and then using the tail lights of the vehicle and light painting. And you can only achieve that when you start shooting at those low ISO, longer shutter speeds, because I could have never accomplished those long streaks of the tail light if I would have shot at at a a faster shutter speed or a higher ISO. Same way here, just old farmhouse, broken down farmhouse. I will point this out because I left this in the picture, but if you look on the side window, you can see me ghosted in the window right there where I stood there and painted from the inside of the window and gave some illumination to that. But this picture here is a combination of using that ISO 100 5 minutes at f5.6, and then I went in and I used the spotlight to paint for about 10 or 15 seconds inside the house with just a spotlight I was shining through the window. And then same way with both of these. The picture on the lower left, that Greenbelt Farmers Co-op building, it's moonlight that's illuminating the face of it. It's dark because you can see the clouds and the stars in the sky. And then I went into the side of the building and shined a red spotlight in the side of the building to light it from the inside. And then with the windmill on the right, that was when it got cloudy on us that night. So you can't really see the stars, but you still see the motion of the clouds and then the moon coming in behind. And I used a blue gelled spotlight just to paint that. And then more and more examples. This is on my Nature Photography Academy I had here a couple weeks ago. That's one of the pictures we took of a hay bale in the field. You can faintly see if it was bigger, you could see it better, but you can see the Milky Way coming in right here, right over the bale. And then this was actually a happy accident. So someone turned on their red headlamp while we were taking a picture, and it gave this red glow on it. When I saw the first picture, I liked it, so we did it again. But I put a spotlight behind the bale to backlight it to help separate it from the rest of the scene. And then once everyone was taking a picture, I stood off to the left side of the bell and then just lit it up for like a half a second just to give it a little bit of light coming in from the other way. And it's it kind of gives it a creative look. It may not be for everybody, but it was good exercise in learning how to do these techniques. And it's a pretty neat technique to learn. And then the picture on the right, I was actually in Alaska at a cabin. We were waiting for the Aurora Borealis to show up, and it was a full moon night. And we were able to shoot pictures lit by not only moonlight, but also light from the inside of the cabin and just a little bit of light painting to fill in some shadows. But that shot, again, it's I can give you the recipe, but every shot you take is different. And I think that's kind of the cool part of it is once you get out there and you start using these base settings that I've taught you already, you get out there and you start trying to figure out like, okay, I've got a shadow here. I need to paint a little bit of light in here. And it usually takes 2 or 3 attempts at doing it, but you figure it out pretty quick. But again, they're all based on these base settings. These are some big silos along some railroad tracks outside of Childress, Texas. And again, went out one night, set up the camera. It's all basically lit by moonlight, but I used a spotlight with a red, amber, and blue filters to paint each one of the silos a little bit and give them a little bit of color. And it took a little bit of time to figure this out and get the right amount of light on it. But once I did, I felt like it turned out pretty nice. And then other subjects you can use that use the same basics as astrophotography and just kind of thinking along the same lines in terms of these base settings and doing the post-processing stuff I'm going to show you in a minute. It can really open up a lot of different opportunities, like when I photograph northern lights, when I go up there to Alaska from time to time. This is a combination of the moon shining on the trees, the base exposure of ISO 3200. How long can I shoot the exposure for to get those pinpoint stars? And then we happen to have a faint aurora in the sky that night, and I was able to shoot a shot like that. And then because I'm always looking at celestial objects, sometimes you've seen this before, is especially this happens in the summer and the fall. This is actually moon set, but because you're shooting through so much atmosphere, the moon looks distorted. And so I thought that was kind of a cool shot. But again, I looked for my foreground subject on this. I think the I think this shot without the windmill would have just been kind of awkward, but I think the windmill kind of gives it some perspective and helps you absolutely know what you're looking at there. And then again, if you thinking about these same base settings and thinking this shot here was taken at 4 o'clock in the morning, using the camera trap, and try to figure out where the deer are moving, and you set up the camera trap and you use those same base settings, and then bring in some, in this case, there were strobe flashes. It wasn't using any kind of light painting, but you're able to shoot pictures like this at night. And then one of the latest things I've done, and this is on my own property, and this is the technique I'm about to show you, because it's the exact same technique here. You look at these fireflies on my property, and it looks like there's thousands of them, and there are thousands of them, but they don't all flash on at the same time. So this is a composite picture, and the way you do a shot like this, and this is how I figured this out, it's the exact same technique as you would use to do a star trail photography. So with that said, let me show you a demonstration real fast. Let me switch screens. Okay, let me move some things around. Can y'all see Lightroom there? Okay, so this is how this works. It's pretty simple. So these are pictures I took. This is I did this in our little nighttime Nature Photography Academy workshop we did a couple weeks ago. And these are the pictures I took. Now, I would wanted more pictures, but as I scroll through these, if you start to notice, see the clouds creeping in from the north. So it was getting cloudy. So I'd stopped. I went and pulled the cameras up before I had a chance. Before it had a chance to kind of materialize itself. Gotta move this window around. So, and if you notice too, there's a couple of lit pictures in here that I was driving around on my buggy and I inadvertently lit the scene with two different shots. That's lights from my buggy I was driving around on. And so I thought I'm going to use these anyway. I'd originally hoped to have about 200 pictures, but I ended up with 50 by the time the night was over. So here's the pictures I shot from that night. And this is how to do star trails. This is how simple it is. You can buy add-on programs or software programs that'll help you do this, but if you're just looking to get introduced to it and do a really kind of simple, sort of easy way of doing it, this is how I do it right here. So here's all the pictures I took. Now here's the key part here. I selected all of those in Lightroom, and then when I go up to photo, and you can do this by right clicking the picture too, I'm going to edit in, and then I'm going to open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, everybody with me there? Now I've already opened these layers up in the interest of time. And so once you click that, it's going to take it a few minutes, but essentially it's going to have one tab open here. But if you look over here on the right, can y'all see Photoshop? Make sure that's switched on. The two I can see on camera. Can you give me a nod if you can see Photoshop on the screen? Okay. So you can see here on the right-hand side in this layers, it loaded all these pictures into the layers panel for me, all 50 of them. Now, when you see me do this, if you've never done it before, you're going to think this is stupid how easy this is. But essentially what I'm going to do is select the first picture, and I'm going to hold down shift, and I'm going to select the last picture. And it selects all of those pictures in that layers panel. Now, once I have all the pictures selected, I'm going to go right above the layers panel, and there's a drop-down menu. It says normal. And this is the, and I'm going to go down here. It's got normal, dissolve, darken, multiply, but I'm going to click the one that says lighten. When I click lighten, look what happens. And so that layer mask, what it does when you select that lighten layer, it lets all the light parts of the pictures in that stack of images shine through. And so now, because of that, I get not only the accidentally light painted pictures that I did by driving around that night, but it also combines all of those individual pictures I took, and it makes them look like a star streak. So that's where the intervalometer comes in play. When we go back here and look at Lightroom, each one of these pictures, I told my camera to take a 30-second exposure. Again, it's 3200 ISO, 30 seconds at f2.8, and that's shot with the 16mm lens on a full frame camera. I arrived at that shutter speed based on that math equation I gave you earlier. And so, but I told my camera, when one picture is finished taking, wait a second and take another picture. And so then the process becomes automated. And so then it's like Ron Popeil's rotisserie oven, set it and forget it. And so I got my camera going, I got it all pre-aimed, pre-focused, everything set up, and then I started the first picture, 30-second exposure, the shutter closes, camera waits a second, and then takes another picture. And it does that over and over and over and over again until you tell it to stop. And so once you take all those pictures, all those individual frames, and again, I'll show you how I did it one more time. Oops, let me go back here. I'm going to undo that. Once I've got all those individual pictures and I select them all, and again, I'm going to right click at this time, edit in, and then open as layers in Photoshop. And that's the key one. Once you click on that, and you give the monkeys a chance to work, and then they open up all these layers over here in Photoshop, then all I did was select the first image, scroll down my list, hold down shift, select the last image, and on this layer mask part, select lighten, and it lets all the light parts of the images shine through. And then bam, oops, wrong one. I was trying to go too quick and I clicked the wrong one. Then all of a sudden it lets all those light parts shine through and you've got star trails. And it's that easy. Again, they make software that does this, and it gets a little more complicated, but I'm not a, typically I'm a fan of simplicity, and I can make this picture better. And again, this was just a really quick attempt at this, but the reason why I started in Lightroom and then did this in Photoshop is because now when I close it, it's going to ask me if I want to save it, and it's going to save that picture. Once it combines them all and does all of its magic, it's going to save that picture back here in Lightroom for me in just a second. And then once I got it back in Lightroom, since I feel like, and this is anecdotal statement, me saying this, because I'm included in this group, I feel like most people are better at using Lightroom than they are at Photoshop. Not to say there's no Photoshop experts, but I think as a general rule, people are more comfortable with doing the color correction and editing your images in Lightroom. Once I create that picture in Photoshop and then close the picture down, it'll save it back into Lightroom for me. Then I can go back and do the last step, is doing all my color corrections, like turning my blacks down or turning my whites up, and just kind of, doing the layer mask and doing all the masking stuff that I might want to do. I can go back into Lightroom and do it, and then it saves the picture for me, and I know exactly where it is, without having to export it, import it back, and do all that stuff. Thought it saved it for me. Oh, it's still trying to save it. So it's a pretty big picture. So with that said, I hope you understand really how easy that part of it is, because that's how I do it. And I'll double and triple down on this comment. My way is my way of doing it. It's not the only way of doing it. It may not be the best way of doing it, but it's my way of doing it, because again, I look for simplicity's sake on how to do some of these things. It's just like I love cooking, and I love simple recipes that yield big results. And so the same way I like to cook is the same way I like to take pictures, is that it can be complicated. You can get as complicated as you want, but for me, simplicity is better, because that way I can go back out and continue to try to be creative and try to figure out how to do pictures of, like I've showed you already, and just be in the problem solving mode, as opposed to just trying to go back and fix everything in post-processing. So with that said, does anybody have any questions? Man, I've been talking for 56 minutes now with no questions at all. And if no one has any questions, I've got a couple more things I'll talk about, and then we will call it a day. I appreciate everybody joining me, by the way. I hope you found some of this enlightening. Again, the hardest part of doing any of these things we talked about is just going out and doing it. It's just making the time to go try something new and to try it. Every one of us are capable of doing it. I mean, it's not like I'm a brain surgeon and can figure this thing out, me and me alone. I mean, everybody has the capability of doing it, but it's just a willingness to go out and make mistakes and try over and over again until you kind of figure it out. But if you'll use those base settings like I talked about, that'll at least get you in the ballpark, and then it's up to you to go out and find uh, good locations with good dark skies or good interesting subjects you can use with moonlight as your shots. The good thing about, I didn't mention this either, the good thing about shooting moonlight is you don't necessarily have to be, you can, one place I'm thinking about is there's I think McKinney Falls State Park right outside of Austin. And so it's not very far removed from the city, but that's a good, you don't have to be real far removed from the city lights to be able to take good moonlit shots. So, because the moon is already running your view of the stars. So, if you can't see any stars for the moon, it's best to wait for a few high clouds in the sky just to give you a little bit of motion and something to look at in the sky. So you just won't have the big dark areas. But anyway, if no one has any questions, I'll go ahead and tell you a couple more things. Hey, don't forget about my other little side project, wildlifephotoshow.com. That's where this webinar ultimately will live, as well as all the other videos I do. I've got a growing list. If you live somewhere near me or want to drive to come see me, I've got a growing list of classes I'm offering here at Hackberry Farm. It's a beautiful location. It's got a lot of neat stuff around here. I'd mentioned Sharon a couple of times. She's coming up for a moonlight photography workshop here in about a week and a half. You can learn more about that if you go to Wildlife Photo Show and click on the photography day camps. And so I got a lot of neat stuff coming up there if you're interested in joining me for some of that. And more than anything, stay in touch. Russell at russellgraves.com. I'm always an open book. Again, I'll pick on Sharon one more time. She can tell you that when you send me an email, I might be a day or two late in returning the email, but I always return emails. So I'd love to see what you guys come up with when you're out taking pictures under the night sky. And again, it's really easy to do. You just got to get out and do it. And so if no one has any questions, I'll leave it at that. Feel free to stay in touch. Hugh, I've been seeing you sneak around in the background. I haven't talked to you in a while. I hope you're doing good. And with that, I will say goodbye. Thanks, everybody, for joining me today. Take care.
Thanks, Russell.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Russell.
Yes, ma'am.